Hello everyone, welcome to Filmgopath. French New Wave director Jean Luc Godard once said, "I think there is a very good film critic in the United States today, a successor of James Agee, and that is Jonathan Rosenbaum. He is one of the best." Today on Filmgopath, we have that one of the best critics ever to have reviewed cinema. It is our pleasure to host Mr. Jonathan Rosenbaum today for a discussion on Abbas Kiarostami's humane masterpiece, The Wind Will Carry Us. Jonathan has been the head film critic for the Chicago Reader from 1987 to 2008, and he has also published and edited numerous books on cinema and has contributed to the publications of Cahiers du Cinema and Film Comment. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a sheer pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Jonathan, I want to start with The Wind Will Carry Us. And my first question to you is that you consider The Wind Will Carry Us to be Kiarostami's greatest film, his richest and the most challenging one. If you could start with that, why do you consider it to be so?
Well, it's his last film that was done on film, which I think is important. It's also interesting that he made the film just before the new millennium. And it's about a woman who's 100 years old. A good deal of his films is an auto-critique, a critique of himself as a filmmaker, but also a critique of cinema as a kind of institution. And I think in a way this film, I think, functions for me as a kind of summary of what he can do best. I know plenty of people who prefer Close-Up, and Close-Up is certainly a great film. But I see him as a landscape artist, and because they're very beautiful landscapes in this film, that's one reason why I think I prefer it. And when I say the greatest, for me, all I mean is the film that I can see the greatest number of times and still discover more, really. And that's what I found to be true. Every time I see it, it becomes a new experience.
Of course. And another very interesting thing that we find in your essay about Wind Will Carry Us, The Wind Will Carry Us, is you say how the reporter Behzad becomes a self-portrait of Kiarostami himself. And that is something we also see in a few of his other films, like in Life Goes On. We see the filmmaker is kind of a self-portrait of himself. In Close-Up, he himself is there, though he is not seen in front of the screen as much as in any other film it would be. So just wanted to know what do you think about him always putting himself as this one character, a self-portrait, and what does it fetch to his docudrama style of filmmaking?
Well, I noticed one thing that The Wind Will Carry Us has in common with Life and Nothing More is that in both cases, he compares the leading character to a little boy. And in both cases, it's sort of like he's more critical, it seems to me, in The Wind Will Carry Us. And of course, one thing that's really interesting is that the boy who was playing the little boy in The Wind Will Carry Us disliked Kirastomai. He told me this himself, and he knew that. So when he actually asked the questions that we hear the character asking him, literally, because when he's filming the boy, and in fact there's a documentary that shows him filming that sequence, and of course all the questions he's asking the boy, Kirastomai is asking him, and then in reverse, but of course we don't realize this. He said the boy keeps saying, "No, I don't think you're a bad man, I like you," but he's very shy and embarrassed, and he's awkward about it because he's hiding the fact that he really doesn't like it. And I do think it's kind of interesting, too, that Kirastomai is very much an anti-Hollywood filmmaker, but one thing he does throughout his career is prove that he's at least as good as an illusionist in creating illusions as Hollywood directors. And he does this all the way through the film because of the way that, for example, the way he gets us believe that the characters are speaking to each other. I mean, the same technique he uses in Feast of Cherry also. And I think there's a certain way in which this is a film that's more timely as a kind of comment of what's going on in the world because of the contrast between city mentality, the mentality of someone who's a media person, and the mentality of someone who lives in a remote village. And I think that that's kind of like very much a contrast one finds all over the world in a certain way. And of course, it's not that they're totally out of reach for the media, because you see a lot of TV antennas in the village. And so I know some people are very annoyed that he doesn't go inside, that it's a film done entirely in exteriors, except for the cellar when he, and I think that that's kind of interesting too, because it's a confrontation with the idea of death, which ties it in with sequences not only in Taste of Cherry, but also in ABC Africa, the films, the preceding this. And it also shows him kind of arrogantly using poetry and his knowledge of poetry to, in a way, almost humiliate the girl or the young woman.
Yes.
And I think that there's a very complex dynamic in this sequence, because we are very much forced to identify with this character. We're not able to identify with the other characters as easily because we know him better and we're with him throughout the whole film. So there's a certain kind of way in which when we watch the film, we wind up auto-critiquing ourselves, I think, also.
Right. So a few sequences as we have in the film, like Behzad kicking the turtle and walking away. I mean, he kind of is a bit more harsh to that self-portrait, I guess, in the Windmill Carriers, in comparison to, say, Life Goes On and all of that. So do you think he also constantly kind of criticizes this gaze of a filmmaker from a distance as we perceive and we look at the villagers and the others, like, say, in close-up as well? So he also does that through his filmmaking?
Well, I think he's very, he's a complicated character, but we also know that he's disconnected. And that's an important part about him, that in order to do this work, he has to miss a funeral in his home.
Yes.
And he also is someone who really not only never becomes close to any of the people in the village, but who lies to them. I mean, because he basically invents this story about a treasure to explain why they're there, So there's a certain kind of way in which, and of course when the little boy is lying when he says you're a good man, it's out of politeness.
Yeah.
Well, lies are a little more sinister because they really don't respect the villagers that much. It's very funny because in some ways this film, as some of his other films do, parodies certain kinds of rules of social etiquette in Iranian society, I think, of the way in which everybody is polite to everybody else. It's something that you can also find in Japan. That there's so much self-censorship that goes on and the way people behave towards each other. It's sometimes really hard to know how people really think and feel about each other, at least if they're strangers.
So you talked about it a little bit. I wanted you to elaborate on this a little bit. In so many sequences, we see that Kiarostami's characters are kept off screen. Why do you think he did that here? Why does he do that across his films?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that he really basically, he told me in an interview that he follows the idea of Bresson to replace an image with sound whenever possible. There are many reasons for this. It's also it has a lot to do with almost the visceral impact of certain scenes, the way we respond to sound, and more unconsciously. Like we think about what we see, but we don't think about what we hear in the same way. But I think it's also, I've actually compared him to Orson Welles in this respect, because Orson Welles said you give an audience only a detail and then you get them participating creatively. And so, and then that's, and in a way, it's sort of like, if he forces you to use, as a viewer, to use your own imagination about these missing characters, then you become a participant in the action. One thing I think is also interesting about this, though, and it's related in some ways, I think, to what he doesn't understand, which is not just about absence, but Jean-Marie Straub saw one of Kirastami's films, and Pedro Costa asked him what he thought of it, and he said, he was very dismissive. He said, it's a film of a tourist. And this really surprised me because Straub loves Jacques Tati. And Tati, in all of his films, is a tourist. Right. And I think that there's nothing wrong with being a tourist. And it's certainly in the two films that we've been discussing, Life Goes On and this film, they're literally, it's people from the city going to the country and a place and the people they're not familiar with. And so it's about the situation about being a tourist. That's the subject of the film. And I think that insofar as you could say that whether he consciously wills it or not, he's addressing an audience outside of Iran. Everyone who watches the film is a tourist also. And that's one reason why we connect with these characters. So I think it's typical of being a tourist that there's a lot of things that you don't understand and that you don't see and that you miss. And partly because he's so motivated by doing, accomplishing certain things, the father, that the son actually sees more and notices more. And the son is less of a tourist. He has more ways of socially integrating himself with the people there. Or so it seems, in terms of what we see. Even
in the windmill carriers, the villagers, they call him engineer. They do not even know he's a reporter and why he has come. They keep on calling him engineer. Yeah, there's also the fact that at least it's implied that a lot of the people in the village are religious, and he doesn't seem to have any connection to religion, at least that we see. He doesn't seem to. So that's another thing that he's missing out on and doesn't understand. In other words, his interest in the idea of people, like at a funeral, scarring themselves or mutilating themselves is almost like a kind of exoticism. It's not it's not a humanist kind of interest. And I think that again, that becomes a critique of what the media often does. In other words, of sort of looking at people from other cultures as if they were zoo animals, and things like that.
I want to ask you that one of the striking aspects, personally for us, was that Behzad not trying to dig out this guy Yusuf himself when he gets buried in the cave. He was digging, but looking for some help frantically, driving in his car. It might be because he was not confident to handle the situation alone, but it felt like it also underlines the difference between him and the other villagers. What do you think about that particular situation?
Well, about getting directions, one thing I noticed during both of my trips to Iran, because I've visited Iran twice, is that at least in Tehran, everybody has to ask directions constantly to get anywhere. I mean, it's sort of like it's a very complicated city, and people are constantly stopping and asking people outside how to get there. So it's a kind of like fact of life. I mean, it becomes very funny in the opening shot of the film when you're hearing these off-screen voices, talking about that they're being lost, and you're seeing, what's also interesting is this kind of twisted line, which is a zigzag line, which is almost like a signature of Kirastomai, that of finding the sort of zigzag line, zigzag motion. The very first short he made, sort of follows a zigzag motion, actually, too, in a certain way. So it's a kind of, we have to realize that in a lot of ways, Kirastomai began as a graphic artist, and a lot of his aesthetic decisions are graphic decisions. And of course, they have interesting consequences, regardless of what motivates them. But I think, and it's also very interesting that the only one, when it becomes almost a kind of metaphor, it has a metaphorical resonance, that the only way he can hear people on the phone is to go to the top of the hill or the mountain and look down on everything, and that's also kind of quite interesting.
Yeah, but what we were also wanting to understand is when this guy, up in the mountain, this guy is digging and he gets buried. Behzad do not try to himself get inside and bring him out. He is worried about this person, but he goes into the car and looks frantically for someone else to help, right? So yes. That's a kind of reaction which you would not expect. You would expect someone to jump, but he does not do that. So that's kind of also the disconnect you kind of see in the responses the city people or a person from the interior should have, right?
Yes, but it also is tied to the fact that when he's trying to flirt with the young woman, he claims to be the boss of her boyfriend, which of course he isn't. But he feels like he is in a certain way. It's sort of like it's an automatic feeling of superiority that he feels to everyone around him, really, and an unearned superiority, in fact. So it's very funny because I know that Kirastomai criticized members of his crew quite a lot about not being, waking up in time and stuff like this. So the complaints of the protagonist, in some ways, are mirror the kind of complaints that Kirastomai had while he was making it. But at the same time, I think he's sort of like, I think one thing that's important to realize about this film is that it's essentially a comedy. I mean, although it's not often seen that way, but it seems to me a lot of the scenes are comic. And its distance from what the opening scene is very funny. And before you even see the characters, when you just hear their argument about where they are, how far it is, and all of this. It's a comedy about social behavior, really. And I think that that's something that, it's a thing that one can trace all the way through his work, because it's very interesting that the earliest of his features that's widely available on DVD now is a film that's about called The Traveler, about a little boy who pretends to be taking photographs when he's not, when in fact he has an empty camera, in order to make money from his, from kids at school so he can attend a soccer match. So from the very beginning, it's like having a character who's connected to the media and who lies and so on, and who, in that sense, takes advantage of other people. It's sort of like, and it becomes an image again of Kirastomai himself. Mm-hmm. Or at least it seems to reflect on his own practice.
One thing which we find in Kiarostami films is his use of interweaved village and beautiful surroundings as character of their own. So a village, a house is already a character in a Kiarostami movie. If you could talk about this setting he uses, which adds to the overall narrative and the theme of the movie itself.
The character he always uses, which I have some problems with, I think he overuses it, is the wise old man. There's one wise old man in each of his films, and like the doctor in this case, who rides the motorbike. But it seems to me that he's ironic about all the characters except for the wise old man, who's, by the way, the film director in Through the Olive Trees. And I think that he loses a certain kind of distance. There's a sentimentality about the way he treats these characters that is not present in the way he deals with all the other characters. And so I think, to me, if I had to talk about any flaws in the film, that's the only thing that, for me, is a flaw.
And what about the picturizations and the way he uses the houses and the surroundings around the movie, the way he constructs it around a village or constructs it around a house? Do you find that very unique to him, or it works for you or not in that sense?
Well, no, I think it's very crucial to the whole idea of the film that he never goes inside the houses except in their basement, and which bothers some people. But I think it also reflects his own relationship to the people in the village too. And it's very interesting that he searched for a long time. He claims for years to find a village like this. So he liked the idea of a village that sort of clings to the edge of the cliff almost. And there's one kind of like it in Where's the Friend's House?
Yes.
Something like that also. So that it has, I mean, and again, that might have been just a sort of graphic desire to sort of film a village like that. Mm-hmm. But it also makes it seem vulnerable in some way, as if you think it might fall, you know. But it's also fascinating the kind of complicated path he has to walk through in order to get to, you know, when he has to walk through his car or cross part of the village and so on. That becomes very interesting. Or even the path of the apple, you know, when they had to spend a whole day just filming the apple to fall the way that it does in that path. That's another case of, you know, sort of like something that looks like it's natural, but is completely constructed, like an illusion, you know, because he wanted it to do that, you know. And again, it's another not straight line, but moving, you know, sort of like at an oblique angle, which again is, you know, thinking graphically.
Right. Right. You talked about the apple, and that's why I'm bringing this up now. We were discussing Close Up with Godfrey Cheshire, and we had mentioned about how there's a scene of the aerosol can which can be kicked, and that is only there for visual aesthetics, the kicking of the aerosol can in Close Up. And similarly, we talked about the apple scene over here. It is not even a deviated subplot, but these scenes, which apparently are not part of the entire plot, keep coming up, like the apple scene here or the aerosol scene in Close Up. If you can talk about these scenes in general, which Kiarostami uses, and how they enrich his entire filmmaking.
Well, it's funny. It's echoed by the way he tosses the bone at the very last shot. You know, it goes into the stream and so on. So that's similar to the thing with the can. I think it's part of this idea, and this is really what I think. If there's a kind of aesthetic message to the world, the wind will carry us. Is the world is much richer than we could possibly know, because there are always things going on. I mean, you know, and again, it's one of the reasons why he uses the sound to replace the image, because we hear things going on that we don't see. You know, there's one shot where we see, I can't remember, it's dogs or cows having sex, you know, and things like this. There are all these sort of peripheral things happening, and it seems to me that the film is largely about that richness in a certain way. And for him to kind of move it, like with the thing with the spray can and close up, is really a way of saying to us where we think the story is not necessarily where the most interesting story is. We can go in another direction. And the things that get left out are sometimes more interesting than the things that get put in terms of journalism and in a sense, the fact that he even misses, you know, his whole, in terms of the meaning for the reason for coming to the, you know, going on this trip, the film, he misses totally. I mean, it's a total failure. But at the same time, you feel like when he leaves at the end, he's learned something. And in fact, one indication of that, it's just a small indication, but at the moment of his frustration, when he sort of like turns over a turtle, you know, in kind of anger, But then later he looks at a snail with admiration, and he doesn't. It's almost like, and it makes you feel like, by contrast to the scene of the turtle, that he's learned something, that he's learned to stop and look, rather than just sort of twist the world around for his convenience or his moves, you know.
Jonathan, that is something we have often wondered. Like, if you are watching a Kiarostami film for the first time, if you are watching Close Up or if you are watching the Windmill Carriers, it will feel like there is this person who would be trying to kind of capture every idiosyncrasies of the world. And then, or if you realize how the filmmaking process happened, you realize that a lot of things were carefully constructed. They were not like, they were not just capturing, they were created. Like in Close Up, for instance, he kind of repeated everything that man went through, the turmoil itself. So at times we wonder, who is Kiarostami? Is this person capturing the whole thing and wanting to pass on that to us? Or is this person manipulating a lot of things and passing on to us? What do you think about that?
The most profound thing he may have ever said to me in an interview was that he can't see the difference between a documentary and a fiction. He literally can't say any film of his own films or other people's films, or one or the other. And this makes a lot of sense when you start to think about it. In order to believe in documentary, we have to believe in certain deceptions. Let me give an example of what I mean. The most famous early documentary, Nanook of the North, right? Not many people know this, but the woman who was introduced to us as Nanook's wife was not Nanook's wife. She was actually Robert Flaherty's girlfriend.
Okay.
And so the point is that that's a kind of blatant example, but there are smaller examples in every documentary film ever made. And in order to make something easy to understand or legible, it's changed. That you can't film something without changing it. And Kirastomai sort of like accepts this, and accepts this as a positive thing, not as a negative thing, whereas most documentary filmmakers would see it as something that interferes with what they're doing. For him, it's another tool that he can use. Because it's kind of like the way a magician works. If you're looking at what the left hand is doing, you're not looking at what the right hand is doing. And and there is a kind of comic vision to this film, which I also think reaches a kind of climax. Because I think, we often forget how much many of these films are comedies in one way or another. And part of it, and again, it's comedy about human behavior. And a lot of it has to do with people. His heroes are always people who are obsessed. And people who are so obsessed that they don't see what's around them.
Right.
And so the film is partly a lesson to the hero and to us about what they're missing. I mean, the little boy who wants to, who goes to all this trouble to go to the soccer match, falls asleep and doesn't go to the soccer match at all. So it's like, there's a kind of way in which he feels affectionate towards the way people are misguided. It's something that we all share, and sort of like that they don't see what's around them because there's so much involved with their conditioning. And so what he's basically trying to do with cinema is to use the conditioning of the cinema to decondition us.
Right. Wow.
By using it against itself.
That's so well put. Thank you.
Jonathan, I wanted to ask you about certified copy, actually, and I wanted to know, how do you perceive the film? Because it gets very extreme reactions from different people. Some people love it, some people hate it. What is your take on that?
Well, while it isn't my favorite of his films, I think it's very impressive in certain ways. One thing that it was, as a career move, it was very smart. Because people, like critics like David Denby in The New Yorker, who wouldn't take him seriously at all, the minute he has Juliette Binoche as the co-star, he got him to take him seriously. Like he wouldn't take if the same part of played by Julie Binoche was played by an Iranian woman. I'm sure he wouldn't have taken it seriously. But I think he's also doing, and he admitted this in many interviews, that he was doing a remake of one of his first real feature, the Report, and which is never been one of my favorites of his films. I mean, in its own way, it's his kind of disturbed auto-critique about the breakup of his marriage. But there is a lot of truth in this film, which I don't see in the Report, actually. But I think that there's a lot of truth in the way this couple behaves with each other. It comes across more powerfully than the artificiality of the way it's set up, which is sort of totally crazy. Complete strangers who suddenly become a couple. And yet we can accept it because of his knowledge of the way couples work is sort of like we believe in. And it's true that the use of landscape is not as integral, I think, as it is in the Iranian films. I mean, I think that he loses something when he leaves Iran. Not as much as Makhmalbaf loses, because I think Makhmalbaf suffers much more as a filmmaker when he leaves Iran. But I do think that there's I think it's a good film, but I think he made better films.
And Jonathan, you have also mentioned about, the basic censorship in Iranian cinema, how they have been also a blessing in disguise. They kind of have got a signature style for the filmmakers over there, including Kiarostami. If you could elaborate on that, what do you exactly mean?
Coming from the fact that I think that the necessity of filming outdoors is partly motivated by the fact that if you film a woman indoors, realistically, she wouldn't be wearing her hijab, but because of the censorship law, she has to wear a hijab. Right. So it's a kind of, it automatically kind of becomes ridiculous. I mean, I have to say that, I spent time with a filmmaker when I was in Iran the last time, when I was teaching about 2 years ago. And it was unbelievable. A filmmaker was having to go in every day and argue with the censor that it was okay for this woman character to be smoking cigarettes in this scene. And he had to argue it in great detail about why he didn't want to have to reshoot the sequence where she wasn't smoking a cigarette. And, crazy things like that. I mean, it was interesting that, one aspect of, I was teaching at a state-run film school, actually. And the amazing thing is the only requirement they placed on my teaching was that I show 2 banned films. So it was a state film school working against the state. And unfortunately, that school no longer exists because of the sanctions. They had to close the school. So, but it was a very impressive, beautiful building, and the people who ran it were very enlightened. So and actually one of the films that I saw there, which I think might be available online now, we finally passed the censor after, 8 or 10 years or something, that was censored for many years. And it's a film that has different English titles, but sort of like Precious Rubbish, I think is one of the titles. It's really about photography in a very interesting way. It's basically about family photographs in which the people in the photographs talk to each other and have arguments. Very good special effects, actually. And it's really like telling almost like the history of Iran in the 20th century through photographs, taken at this war or that event, during the revolution and so on. And it's done as a comedy, actually. It's quite an interesting film, but it's, I don't think it's sort of like, you might be able to find it on the internet, but I don't know if it's sort of like, if it's available commercially or not. Anyway, I think it seems to me that having to work around the censorship, which is also true to a certain extent what I find fascinating is that one of the periods when American cinema was most censored was the 50s. And yet, if you look at the Hollywood films of the 1950s, there's more social criticism in those films than I think there has been before the 1950s or since the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So that they have, and a lot of it has to do with what you find in most countries that have censorship, is it becomes, you use symbolic language, you use metaphors, you do all kinds of things, but it still comes out as social criticism. And of course, one thing that's changed now is that social criticism in American cinema now is what you can see on a table, but not in movie houses. It seems to me that the films that really address the way Americans live and all of this tends to be what you can see on Netflix, but not what you can find in most movie theaters. To exaggerate the tendency. The films that win Oscars are films that have a little bit of social criticism, but not too much.
Yeah. We have heard that this particular film was also censored for some time in Iran over the cellar scenes where Behzad, the reporter, recited Furugh Farkhuzad's poetry, from which the film gets its title. We have watched it many times, but even going by the most stringent standards, we don't have a clue that why the film will face such censorship. Do you have any views on that? Why?
I think one thing you have to realize is that it's not often. Sometimes it's based on completely irrational things that have to do with the feelings they have towards the filmmaker. I mean, that can happen too, because I know. To give you an example, when Zhang Yimou had a lot of censorship problems with some of his films, it was really because he was having an illicit relationship with his leading lady. It doesn't have anything to do with what was in the films. But it was kind of considered a scandal. And I think I think the fact that there's a flirtation going on, and that it's an erotic poem, and that Furugh Farkhuzad is always she's a complicated figure because she was, someone who committed adultery and was considered a whore and all of this, but she's also widely considered the greatest 20th century Iranian poet, and she was the first Iranian poet who wrote about erotic subjects, and so I think all of that, comes into what the impact of that scene, and he's obviously quoting her as a kind of sexual come on. I mean, at least that's the implication. So I think that they picked up on that, and that's probably what they were objecting to. I'm just guessing.
Right. So it's not only about what you show in the film, it's also about the source material and things like that.
Yeah, but I think this is always the case when you think about it.
Yeah.
You know that Otto Preminger in The Moon is Blue in the early 50s was condemned by the Catholic Legion of Decency because he used the words pregnant. Pregnant was considered bad. Seduce. There wasn't anything he showed. It was just using the word in the dialogue of pregnant and seduced and maybe one or the words like that. I mean, it's sort of like, so it seems to me that you can't really understand censorship unless you sort of read in the precise cultural situation at that moment. Because it changes and the rules change. There was a time in Iranian cinema when it was illegal to show close-ups of women, for example, and then it's okay. So it's sort of like it's not something that you can sort of necessarily think has rational basis. What happens in this country, which is really unfair, is that if the film is an independent film, it's more likely to be censored or to get a different rating. Whereas it's a big studio film, it's less likely. In other words, it's basically the MPAA is run by the studios for the studios. It's not an objective organization. Just like the American Film Institute is a pro-industry thing, and that's why when they listed the 100 greatest films of American cinema, they didn't list originally any of Chaplin's films or any of Cassavetes. because they weren't, you know, they weren't studio films, they were independent films. So, you know, I think there's always this subtext that we have to kind of keep in mind.
I think, Jonathan, I think we are towards the end of our discussion today, and it was so fantastic to listen to you and learn from what you say. And everything you said, actually, I could create a mental picture around that, and it's really inspiring to be able to talk to you. We wanted to do this for so long, so. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We are really, really honored that you could give us some time this evening, and we had this great opportunity to listen to you and learn from you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
So thank you.